welcome to EconVersations. I'm Dan Sutter with the Johnson Center here at Troy University, your host. Last week on EconVersations, we talked about the possibilities for reforming Medicaid. Medicaid is one of the big three federal entitlement programs. Some people despair at the prospects of ever getting entitlement spending under control. But in the United States, we have had some success in dealing with an entitlement program. Back in 1996, President Bill Clinton signed an act ending welfare as we know it. We're going to talk about our lessons from welfare reform tonight and talk about some work that I've done on this topic for the Mercatus Center. And to assist me here tonight, we've brought back Scott Beaulier, the Executive Director of the Johnson Center, and he's going to resume his former role of asking questions of the host. And tonight he's going to ask me some questions about welfare reform.
That's right. Great to be back, Dan. And I'm only doing this one time.
Okay.
so let's get into it and talk a little bit about your research and welfare reform. Let's start with something that a lot of people have difficulty understanding, the issue of welfare and what exactly you mean by welfare. I think of it, and it could mean anything from corporate welfare to Social Security to Medicare,
Right.
but that 1996 legislation was very targeted welfare reform, correct?
Right, exactly, yes. And we do use the term welfare even to refer to the welfare state, meaning all of the various different transfer and social insurance programs that we have. But specifically, the 1996 reforms dealt with the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program. And so this was inaugurated back in the 1930s, and this was the cash transfer program. So most of the other welfare or low-income assistance programs provide other types of assistance. So for instance, like food stamps, so provide food stamps as opposed to cash. This was the cash program, which came to be known as AFDC, or Aid to Families with Dependent Children.
Okay. Now, let's talk a little bit about the timing of it. The mid-1990s were a period in which there was a lot of wrangling and not a lot of agreement. There were government shutdowns in the 1990s. Right. You had the contract with America. Mm-hmm. Why did we get welfare reform right at that moment in the mid-1990s?
Well, I think there were two reasons. First, had to do a lot with this gentleman. This is Charles Murray, a sociologist, I think, by training. And he wrote a pioneering book back in the 1980s. I think 1984, the first edition came out, called Losing Ground. And he documented some of the societal impacts and costs of the welfare state, of our welfare programs. And in fact, in particular, there are devastating effects on low-income recipients themselves. How they led to family dissolution and out-of-wedlock births and many other social problems. And so Murray's work, a little more than a decade in advance, helped set sort of, I think, the background for reform. More specifically, beginning under the first President George Bush, around 1990, Bush started approving some waivers for state AFDC programs that allowed them to conduct some experiments to try and figure out ways to get people off of welfare and into the workforce. Because Murray had identified some of the problems with the people being on welfare, especially extended welfare dependency, but there's a chicken and egg problem of trying to get people off of welfare and into the workplace. And so these experimental programs were trying to design some incentives to help people make this transition.
So federalism at the state level, essentially. You know, some states just
Exactly.
kind of experimenting and it scaling up from there.
Right,
yeah.
Exactly.
We have a picture here of the actual signing of the bill, and it's something that both parties have really taken credit for. Clinton views it as one of his major pieces of legislation that was a success. Same with Newt Gingrich, who we have here as well. And it really was somewhat of a coming together, I guess, right?
Yes, it was a bipartisan effort.
Mm-hmm.
Both some leading Democrats like Clinton as well as Republicans joined together on this. Mm-hmm. Certainly the Republicans could not have overridden a Clinton veto had he chosen to oppose the reforms. But he embraced reform, especially early in 1996, and then eventually the bill that got passed in August of 1996.
And one of the key parts of it is this idea we talked a little bit about last week, block granting, and the idea that money is allocated in a fixed amount, and then, at least in the Medicaid case, which I've experienced, it's states get a certain amount of money, and then they carve out and create their program as they see fit at the state level. Is that kind of what you're talking about here as like a major part of the legislation?
Yes. The 1996 Reform Act did several things, one of which was the AFDC program had been operating under a system of matching grants. And with matching grants, the federal government would provide money to the states based on the state contribution. And with AFDC, the matching rate was anywhere from $1 to $1 with some states up to $4 of federal dollars for every dollar of state funding. So AFDC was under this matching grant formula. The matching grants were replaced with block grants, so that if states could obtain any savings on the programs, they could keep whatever they saved. And then also the 1996 Act ended or allowed for the institutionalization of these work incentives and work requirements. So that people had to, they allowed states to make working a condition of receiving the assistance. They established also lifetime limits on how long somebody could receive the program benefits. And AFDC was scrapped entirely. It was replaced by a new program that's called Temporary Assistance to Needy Families. And so the entitlement, because AFDC was an actual entitlement program, anybody who met the qualifications, the circumstances of the program, was entitled to receive this cash transfer. That was eliminated with TANF. There's no entitlement here because if you're up against the lifetime limit, you're no longer eligible to receive the benefit. So there are a number of different components to the reform, but I think probably, at least in today's reform debates, it's the work with matching grants versus block grants that were so important.
Yeah. I assume that there were, and we have a few quotes here that I'll put up in a minute, I'm assuming there were many who were outraged about this reform, you know, particularly the notion that a program was going to be temporary. You think about even the language of a temporary ANF, whatever the ANF part is, you know, and you say, gosh, this is something you're going to have to get off of, and that probably rubbed a lot of liberals the wrong way in this particular case.
It surely did, and many, many liberals accused Clinton of selling out, and many at the time, both in Congress and then amongst the broader policy community, thought that this act was just going to be disaster. We have a couple of quotes here. One from Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who himself was a noted contributor to the welfare policy debate back in his days as a professor. Right. Moynihan mentioned that this was the most brutal act of social policy since Reconstruction, and Ted Kennedy called it a legislative child abuse. Representative Dick Gephardt thought it would put up to 1 million low-income children in dire straits. The Urban Institute and other policy groups were chiming in similarly, just attacking Clinton for a betrayal of an important liberal safety net program, and and just predicting that there would be terrible consequences.
In academic work, economists call this the race to the bottom, I believe, and you use that expression in your own research. Is that indeed the race to the bottom? And do we see much evidence? You're going to get to the data here in a minute. Do we see much evidence of a race to the bottom for the poor as a result of this reform?
Well, race to the bottom, I think, is an important term to understand in policy debates. It's thrown around a lot. And specifically, it would refer to circumstances under which we could have excessive cuts, but cuts that you or I, the average person in most states, would consider to be too great. And that there could be some ways in which the competition would work to lead to too much cutting of welfare programs. There are several reasons why specifically welfare programs might be subject to a race to the bottom. One is the fact that welfare assistance provides a type of a public good. If we're Americans and we care about the well-being of all lower income or all Americans who are down in their luck, then simply because lower income families happen to live in California, for instance, when the state of California and their program helps out lower income Californians, they're helping out lower income Americans, and we in Alabama would benefit as a result from this. They're in effect providing assistance that we might want to see provided. Maybe we don't have to provide it ourselves. And naturally, then legislators in California are probably going to only consider the benefits that their constituents, their taxpayers and residents of California receive. They're going to ignore the fact that when they help out the poor in their state, they're actually providing these benefits to people across the country. So that was one reason. And then there's also some fear that if the states had a higher level of welfare benefits than surrounding states, they could become, in fact, a welfare magnet. Mm-hmm. And so even if some states started with very generous benefit levels, if some of the other states cut their benefit levels, then you could see welfare recipients migrate from the states that have cut their benefits significantly to the states that are still trying to provide higher levels of benefits, which maybe in a more liberal state they might be thinking reasonable or livable, a living level of benefits for recipients. But then with the migration of many recipients to their state, then even states that want to be more generous could end up in having to cut benefits. So for these reasons, there is at least a plausible argument that could be made that you could end up seeing too much cutting of spending in these programs. And conversely, this is also the reason why many policy scholars thought that the federal government should have a role in low-income family assistance or welfare programs in the first place, because of the fact that you have these spillovers between states, and that when one state helps out the low-income families in their state, they're actually providing benefits to other states as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's turn to some of the charts you've provided. Sure. and the data here. I'm curious about a couple of things as we look at these. Did the reforms that we've celebrated so much really constrain the welfare state, and have they checked spending? And then another thing that maybe your data will help us answer is whether or not indeed people slipped through the cracks, and we saw kind of the bottom fallout on the welfare state. So let's go ahead and just look at the first one here. And this is, just walk us through this and help us understand
this. This shows the caseload of the Aid to Families, Dependent Children, and then TANF program beginning in 1996, the total number of recipients in these programs. And it's in millions. The scale is here in the millions. So you can see that in the early 1990s, we had between 12 and 14 million families that were receiving AFDC assistance. Now, that fell very precipitously in the 1990s. Although you can see that the decline started a little bit before the 1996. It started actually in 1994, and that was as some of these state programs, state policy experiments were starting to have an effect. Some of the early experimenting states were actually having success moving people off the welfare rolls and into the workforce. But then, as that spreads nationwide after 1996, you can certainly see there's a dramatic reduction beyond then to 6 million by 6 million recipients. By the time you get to 2000. And so there's about a 60% reduction from the peak in early 1990. And furthermore, that's remained constant. We didn't have the statistics for 2010, but even with the Great Recession, we can see that there was an uptick in the number of recipients from just under 4 million to a little over 4 million, which in percentage terms is a decent sized percentage size uptick. But it's clearly a permanent reduction in the number of households that were receiving these benefits.
Mm-hmm. Just for my own curiosity, what were some of the states that were the early reformers? Do you happen to remember their names?
Wisconsin was one of the leading ones that had pioneered reforms and was having success getting people off of welfare and into the workplace. And in fact, Wisconsin had received earlier in 1996 a waiver to expand their experimental program to scrap their entire state AFDC program with essentially what was a TANF type program.
Okay, yeah. Let's move ahead to your next chart here, and this is total spending. And on the y-axis there we have billions of dollars, and then time on the x-axis. Right. And how would you interpret this graph?
In this case, we can see is largely spending, total spending has remained unchanged. And so if you look from around 1993, 94 through 2007, 2007, say before the last recession, spending was around $25 billion. And that's in real terms, so we're adjusting for inflation, but we have had population growth. And what's sort of missing in this number is relative to the growth of other entitlement programs. This would happen to be one case where just staying still is considerable progress compared to the steep increases over that same 15 years or so that we've seen in Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security spending. So the other big entitlement programs have continued to grow at a very fast pace. Overall, spending on the AFDC/TANF program has remained pretty constant from the early 1990s.
Yeah, it really has, and I think that's a fair way of summing it up, that that this is actually a success and that it stayed constant. I'm so used to seeing charts that just go, almost have an exponential shape to them when you get to, the 1990s until 2013. It's really explosive government growth in most cases.
Definitely.
So,
And so here is definitely an instance where just maintaining spending has been a success.
Yeah. Here we have just a couple of other charts. This is per recipient. Now this one's looking more like the charts I would expect to see. It's upward sloping, and it seems to be pointing to a lot more spending. But I think you have an interpretation of this that is consistent.
One way of thinking of it, if the total spending has remained about constant and the number of people receiving benefits has fallen by 60%, then clearly spending per recipient has gone up. But one thing to keep in mind is that under TANF, we're talking about spending on things other than just cash assistance, cash transfers. Part of the TANF programs were all designed to try to help make sure people didn't just stop receiving cash benefits, but that they entered the workplace. And so you had things like workplace training, workplace assistance, trying to efforts to go out and try to find employers who would be willing to hire people who had been on the welfare ranks, are all part of what the state TANF programs have worked with. And so in one sense, yes, spending has gone up per person, but we are spending it on slightly different things in an effort to try to help make sure that this is now temporary assistance as opposed to permanent assistance.
And I think a few of the next ones are going to get into the poverty issue and what's happened to the poor as we look at this program over time.
Right, because I think what's important to keep in mind here is that the goal of proponents of welfare reform at the time was that we can get people off of welfare and into the workplace, and they won't suffer an unduly high level of pain. Yes, that they will have to start working as opposed to simply receiving cash benefits. And so there would be some transition involved there. But the idea was not to simply leave these families with no resources. The idea would be that if you got them into the workplace, then they would be able to take care of themselves. And furthermore, if you could credibly convince them that there won't be government money for them if they didn't get a job, and that would help provide the stick, so to speak, of making sure that they got out and found jobs to work. So Representative Gephardt had mentioned the possibility of many millions of children being falling into poverty. And probably the best statistical measure to try to get at this would be the child poverty rate. And so here we see the child poverty rate in the United States. And in the early 1990s, it was up over 20%. But that was before the reforms. It had gone up in the early 1990s. There was a recession in 1991, and so the child poverty rate always sort of moves with the business cycle, and usually a little bit behind the business cycle. So recession in 1990-91, and the child poverty rate was still rising in 92 and 93. So then we see a significant reduction of child poverty rates after welfare reform. Now, some of that was clearly due to a strong economy at the time, but what you can see is that even when we get into 2001, or for that matter, with the very steep recession that we had in 2008 or 2009, the child poverty rate did rise in 2008 and 2009, but only back to a level that we saw in the early 1990s after a much more mild recession. And the 2008 recession was far worse than that 1990-91 recession. And so the fact that the child poverty rate, even in the midst of the worst economic downturn we'd had since the Great Depression, was no higher than it was in the early 1990s, I think is a strong evidence that we didn't simply cast the recipients out into the wilds here, and the child poverty did not spike like some folks like the Urban Institute and Senator Kennedy feared it would have.
Yeah, it looks like a very smooth graph, in fact. I wonder if you can shed any light on just kind of the sentiment many Americans have that there's just greater and greater dependence on welfare, though. You know, you hear about people getting thrown out of work, not being eligible for a welfare program, and just getting a doctor to say you're disabled or something. And, you know, it kind of resonates that some of these trends are on the rise, right? It's
right.
just, is it a different welfare program you're talking about?
This is different welfare programs. Okay. I mean, so in the narrow sense of was welfare reform a success, if you think of just the cash transfer program, the AFDC TANF, the numbers seem overwhelming. We've seen a sharp reduction in the number of welfare caseloads. But if you think of the welfare state a little more broadly conceived, the federal government has, I think, the Cato Institute counted 126 different welfare types programs, or programs that assist lower income families. I believe 80 or so of those programs actually have some means testing. So these would be programs that are designed to assist low income families or low income individuals. So there are a large number of programs, and overall the Cato Institute estimates that total government spending on these different programs is just under $1 trillion. So there's still a substantial amount of assistance that's going on. In housing policy debates, there's concern voiced about trying to get mixed income developments for people who live in federal Section 8 housing programs or federal housing projects, because of the concern that people would be living in the housing projects in an environment where nobody works. And so the fact that there are many people who don't work on a permanent basis is still true, and they are still getting various types of federal assistance. They are no longer getting the cash assistance necessarily, but we do see some evidence of this. I think if we move ahead here, here's the food stamp program. The food stamp program is interesting because, sort of like AFDC and TANF, food stamps in the 1990s also became subject to work requirements. And what you can see is that there was a similar decline in food stamp recipients between the early and mid 1990s to around 2000, 2001. Again, the number of food stamp recipients moves with the business cycle. So in 2000, 2001, there was a minimum there, and then a slight uptick. So there were work requirements that were imposed on food stamps, and the number of food stamp recipients declined, and then remained pretty much constant if you look in the mid 2005 compared to the early 1990s. You can see that they spiked up substantially, and not just due to the Great Recession, but in 2009 the Obama administration waived the work requirements, and so there's almost in very short order like a 40% increase in the number of food stamp recipients. So there are I guess conversely, this also shows the effect of work requirements. I mean, when people are required to work, it does affect the number of recipients. And then probably what's also of concern is the increase in the number of people being qualified as disabled. And so this is shows the number of new Social Security disability awards. And for many years, they were constant at around 600,000 a year, and then rose in the early 2000s to around 800,000 a year, and just over the last few years, it's gone up to about 1 million. So if you think of 1 million versus 600,000 a year, that's about a 2/3 increase in the number of disability awards. This is also worth noting because back in 1990, we passed the Americans with Disabilities Act, the idea behind that being that many disabled people should be able to work. We have a very extensive division of labor, so there should be jobs where even if you don't have some skills, there should be other jobs that disabled Americans should be able to hold. And the idea of the Americans with Disabilities Act was to try to get them out in the workforce and working. But what we can certainly see is that there's been a sharp increase in the number of Social Security disability awards. And this is also of relevance for TANF because TANF's work requirements and lifetime eligibility requirements only apply for able-bodied individuals. If you are declared disabled, you are no longer subject to those requirements.
Are a lot of TANF people running out of eligibility actually rotating over and claiming disability, or is it a small, tough to pick up?
Well, the number suggests that's true.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, in terms of the detailed studies, how many would be former TANF recipients who are thus getting classified as disabled.
Mm-hmm. We have just a few minutes left. I'm curious what your big takeaway from this research into TANF is for the prospects for entitlement reform more broadly, the welfare state, its size and scope as we look ahead. The big programs of Medicaid and Medicare and this steady, not even a creeping, steady increase in entitlement spending where we're up over $1 trillion on 126 programs. Is there any kind of major hope that they can learn from TANF's success and reform other programs, or are we just going to waffle along with a case here and there of success?
Well, I think TANF reform does show that block grants are not a magic bullet. There's no magic formula involved here. They can't eliminate resource costs. If we choose to provide assistance to certain Americans, it's going to be costly. But it does create, I think, on the margin, a better environment for spending because states have to pay the full cost of any benefits that they want to expand in their state programs. And conversely, then they also get to capture the full savings. And so if they take better steps to make sure to police fraud in their program, they get to save those full savings. So I think that's one of the important takeaway points. I think that concerns about a race to the bottom turned out to be unfounded here, and specifically through a mechanism called maintenance of effort requirements that were imposed in 1996 as part of the Welfare Reform Act. And so I think a race to the bottom, although theoretically there's a valid argument to be made, empirically turned out to be not certainly surmountable. It was not insurmountable by any step in the imagination. And then finally, these state programs are incredibly complex. One of the things that we saw, and one of the big advantages of block grants, was that the flexibility they provided states, because state programs are so complicated, so involved, and there's so much history involved with them. And you can't very well start a program from scratch. And the block grants gave the flexibility that simply weren't going to be there with matching grants.
Mm-hmm. This is great stuff, and we're just about out of time. I think I'll toss it back to you for a wrap-up. Maybe I'll come back on one more time if you're doing great work like this.
Well, if I have something some more research to talk about, I guess we'll have to have you back on. Thanks
it's been fun.
for coming on and filling in your old role. And thank you for joining us this evening. We'll be back next week with another edition of EconVersations. Thank you.